Well, here we are again, Dean, week 10 of the Asynchrony podcast.
And we're back.
And we're back continuing this 10 weeks of discussion. This will be. Last time we had been talking about socialism and, kind of you were trying to get an idea of kind of where I'm coming from. And we've talked about the whole idea of trying to get to a point of understanding of our different perspectives. If not to bring them into total synchrony, maybe to at least find some kind of mutual compatibility and also a better understanding, right? So that we can each kind of give an understanding or be able to explain the other's perspective in a way that the other one would actually appreciate and agree with, right?
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that we identified coming in, I think we both felt like this, is that we feel like that one of the things driving the division is that both sides, however you want to describe that, don't really understand the perspective of the other side.
Right, right. And we're also kind of looking at different, almost different realities, right? As because of that.
Right. Yeah. I think we've seen some of how we've developed that, and it's one of the things that I had considered at the tail end of the conversation. Wanting to kind of look back and see, address the questions that we came into this with and what kind of conclusions we've drawn after 10 weeks of conversation on it.
Right.
Because I feel like that we're in a very similar place on what we would say on that, and I kind of like to test that to see. So
Right, exactly. But you had said that after our discussion last week, you still didn't quite kind of have a full grasp of my perspective on socialism and kind of how I was coming at the subject. Is that a
yeah,
fair representation?
I had some initial ideas, and I kind of want to reference. I don't know if you're going to get into this, but I want to kind of harken back to we had identified that there were three different kind of aspects of socialism that get talked about in the conversation that don't get differentiated.
Right.
Um, if I recall correctly, those were governmental, economic, and then more kind of communitarian sociological.
Right. Right. Yeah.
And
Well, so let me give you a little more detail then as far as how my brain works on this subject.
sure.
Um, I've been pretty much a Democrat most of my life. In fact, I've been political most of my life. I really can't really remember a time. Whereas you have said you kind of came to politics later in your years. I kind of started out kind of a political junkie right from the start.
Uh,
Um,
would it be fair to say that your political your group political identity would be a fairly important part of your personal identity,
it's
or
it's
has
always been
historically
a
been?
big part of my personal. Yes, definitely.
Okay.
Yeah. A big part of my identity, yeah, and not necessarily just the partisan aspect of being a Democrat, right, quote unquote, but somebody that looks at things from definitely a decidedly liberal perspective in the liberal versus conservative type of use of the word, not liberal as far as classical liberal necessarily, although I do believe very much in classical liberalism in a lot of ways, but one of the things that really was a foundation for that for me personally is having grown up as a minister's kid, right, in the Christian
Right.
church.
Hmm.
And although I'm not a what you would call a religious person today, as far as going to or attending or being a member of an actual church or specific religion, I still, you can't really beat that those lessons out of a person, right? They're very kind of foundational when you're raised in that environment. And, the way I saw it was almost in a sense of, when I looked at the idea of socialism, it was almost the way that I don't know if you're familiar with the movement in the 19th century of what's called Christian socialism, but it was a big movement in the 19th century, and it blended kind of Christian ethics with socialist economics specifically. And, it was talking about the things like, where Jesus talks about going, easier to go through, a camel to go through the eye of a needle
A
than a rich
needle
man
than
to enter the
understanding.
kingdom of heaven, right? That kind of
Hmm.
thing. And so it was decidedly kind of anti-materialistic, capitalistic type of mentality, right, and approach to their Christianity.
And
And that
so
was kind of instilled at me in me at a very young age, and what that translated to was a strong sense of tied in with my belief in liberty and my belief in equality, because I also felt like, in the Christian tradition, equality was a big thing in the Gospels, right? As far as trying to treat people equally and trying to see people's value as equal, not necessarily that everybody has equal abilities or, that type of thing, but that we at least value people equally, um, in that type of an egalitarian type of valuation. And, of course, both of us grew up and kind of came of age in the 1980s primarily, right? I mean, when we
right.
really started to, that's when we became adults. That's when we kind of formulated who we were going to kind of be as adults and, and grown ups. And of course, that was right at the height of the Reagan administration and the Gordon Gekko and Wall Street and greed is good and all of that kind of thing. And it was a very materialistic period, right, in American politics and American culture in general. And I reacted very strongly against that. Actually, in fact, when I in 1984, I was 16 and right in the middle of the Reagan years, and when he trounced Mondale that year, that was really the kind of one of the first early elections that I really followed closely, right? And I wrote what I called it a manifesto, but it was really just kind of an essay, that what I saw was an irony shaping up in our culture where it was actually the same people who grew up as teenagers in the 60s and were hippies now turning into yuppies, right? It's the same generation. And
Yep.
I saw a very weird kind of dichotomy or evolution, really, I should say, um, politically in American culture, where these same people who were inspired by JFK's speech about "ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country," and I saw Reagan as kind of turning that upside down, saying, "Oh, no, no, don't worry about what you can do for your country. Let's see what our country can do for you," um, and in terms of materialism and capitalism and greed is good and all that kind of thing. So that was very foundational for me in terms of kind of becoming a grown up and finding my place in the American culture and society. Um, Having said all that, when you ask me a question such as, "Are you a socialist?" Like we were playing around with the idea, "Are you a fascist?" in the previous episode, right? And
Hmm.
kind of tongue in cheek, but still, um, I bristle a little bit at the label of socialist, right? Even democratic socialist, which I think is one way to people try to water it down in a sense, because I don't necessarily think in terms purely of collectivist um, extremes, right? I think that their individualism and individual rights, individual um, opportunity, all of those things are vital to liberty, right? And liberty is a core value that we both share,
Right.
that we've talked about before. And so, that's kind of where I'm coming from when I talk about socialism, because in a sense, it's almost an irony in itself that we downplay the other perspective in a sense, or criticize the opposite perspective for the same reasons in a sense. Like, so on the more conservative or traditionally right side, people will look at it and say, well, socialism won't work because people just can't be that altruistic, and it's natural for people to want things and to want to succeed and to better their situation, and we want to be able to encourage them to do that and give them motivations for doing that, right? And so there's a cynicism there of not really trusting people to do it for the right reasons, right? And it just won't work. It's not practical. And the same cynicism is on the left, where you say, well, yeah, but because people are greedy and we know people are greedy, we have to kind of find some level of coercion, right? Of trying to force this equal opportunity on the system, right? Overall, and that led to our discussion last time where we talked about you were coming at things from kind of a bottom up type, situation where I was coming maybe a little bit more from a top down type of perspective. And that's a typical thing when you start talking about socialisms, kind of top down mentality, right?
And I don't want to completely derail on this point, but that confuses me because my understanding and I want to go back to something after I say this, but that my understanding of the socialist perspective is that it's generally opposed to there being a hierarchy, and a top down perspective is a hierarchical perspective. So
Yes,
I'm
it can be, but it doesn't have to be necessarily. I mean, what I'm not talking about top down from necessarily a hierarchical narrowing of power necessarily. Um, it's more of a lattice structure laid over the top of society. Kind of rules and conditions and kind of the terms and conditions, right, for a working and balanced society,
okay. So
if you
that
will.
I'll address that in a second because that very much mirrors one of the things that I've actually been thinking as I try to put things together.
Hmm.
But I wanted to kind of attempt to present what I feel like I'm getting your point back to you and confirm my
Okay.
understanding. So
All right.
I came out of last week's conversation kind of feeling like that your primary focus out of the three elements of socialism that we talked about and we just mentioned again, your focus is on the third one, the social aspect, the I would phrase that as the idea of that every member of society is responsible for making sure that doing what they can to make sure that every other member of society is doing as well as they can. And then the economic aspect is kind of derived from that. Um, but that's kind of the basic idea. And that lattice work idea that you just introduced, I feel like that really corresponds to that as well. It's a social network that we're all linked to each other, and it's in all of our collective best interest to make sure that everyone else in the network is, doing as well as they can so that we can do as well as we can, or, it's just
Right.
it's a natural function of that.
Yeah, I think that's a fairly accurate way of putting it as far as how my brain works anyway.
Okay.
So,
So, all
go
right.
ahead.
So I well, I'm just so, we've gotten that step done. I've been able to reconstruct your argument to you in a way that you agree with. So I understand where you're coming from.
Hmm.
And, as I alluded to, I don't disagree. Now there's a little more to my thinking on that, but that is definitely a component of it. I
Right.
agree with the idea that we are all connected socially and we all have a responsibility to that connection, um, which I mean is in our own best interest. It's
Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
it's that's one of the ideas that gets pointed to that why capitalism is said to be a better system is it incentivizes people to consider the needs of others because they are rewarded for doing that.
Right.
If
Right. And I don't disagree with that
yeah,
necessarily. Yeah. I mean, I guess for me, it comes down to, um, and I look at it the same way. For a while there, I went to a Christian college, right, and partly because my dad taught there, so it was free. So I
yeah,
mean, it'd be kind of stupid not to. But at the same time, and it is a good school. But the one of the things that I used to say to people then that, and partly just to get a rise out of them, but also because there's a lot of seriousness in it, that I would call myself a Christian agnostic, right?
hmm
Which I was basically saying that if I look at all of the different types of philosophies out there in terms of if you chose one that, and pushed it to its maximum effectiveness, which would be the one that would end up with the best society? right? And to me, that seemed to be Christianity, or at least the things that Christianity taught, right? The ideas that Christianity taught. And I see the opposite in a sense with capitalism in one sense, not that capitalism can't be very good, especially in the purest sense of, the kind of the Adam Smith invisible hand type of capitalism, but and it does also raise people out, can raise people out of poverty very effectively. We've seen that historically. You can't argue with that. But if it's pushed to its extremes, right, then it, for me, is a very bad thing, right? Because it actually will eventually destroy liberty as opposed to ensuring it. That's kind of where I think that goes if you push it to the maximum limit.
Well, it would I would modify the phrasing a little bit. I would say if you
Okay.
allow it to go to the maximum limit.
Right.
S you know, I don't disagree that that's kind of going to be to the natural progression. I mean, that kinda goes back to my thinking on organizations too. I mean, if you take something where, if you begin to, um, prioritize only profit, then, that's where you get to. It's almost like you hear about this a lot in the AI discussion. You're familiar with the, paperclip problem, right? Yeah. So, that's one of the things that they say is,
Well, you can
the pro
explain it just so our audience knows if you want to.
yeah, I was gonna do that. I didn't
Yep, go for it.
our whole conversation can't be inside illusions. So,
Right.
um,
Inside
for
baseball.
anybody who's not familiar with the idea is that one of the potential problems in instituting AI is not that, it's not the Terminator thing, it's that it has a narrow focus. So if you were to ask an AI to produce the maximum number of paper clips, that it will focus on only that, and so it will consume all of the available resources in the universe to be able to manufacture paper clips.
Right. Or
So,
as much as it can get its hands on anyway, right, yeah. Mhm.
yeah, I mean, until it consumes itself, it's going to continue to produce paper clips. So it's, you know, that is that vision of capitalism that
Yes,
if the focus is money, then it's going to consume all of the resources, including itself, to produce money. And there's some evidence that you see some of that. Um, I wanted to just make note of something that you just said because I think it's something that we can carry forward as a potential point of agreement. Just in like the philosophical perspective, you said that you felt looking at Christianity, having been educated in that you felt that that was one of the more effective philosophies if a society would adhere to that in producing the best results for everyone.
well, the best results, I guess in a sense, I'm looking at it a little bit like a philosophical utilitarian would look at it, right? The
Mhm.
maximizing the most amount of happiness and satisfaction for the most amount of people, right? Yeah.
It's one of the and I mean, you can argue for other perspectives, but it's one of the philosophies that has been produced in the world and has stuck around for a while that, when enacted, provides the most encouragement for the people in there to make sure that they are involved in that lattice work that we were talking about and making sure that they are considering everyone else instead of just prioritizing their own needs. So
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah.
that's one of the, I mean, we come from Anderson, Indiana. We were both brought up Christian, you know, that pretty much goes without saying. Um, and I still consider myself a Christian, but
Sure.
I've also looked at a lot of other different ideas, and especially over the last few years of like studying more philosophy and that type of thing. And I mean, we've discussed this offline, but big interest in like classical mythology and Norse mythology and all kinds of other, systems too. I've always found all of that really interesting. So one of the things in looking at philosophy and psychology and all of that recently, over the last few years, I've been led very strongly back to that conclusion, is that, that out of kind of what we have available today, if we were to really adhere to the principles of that, it produces good results. And I've seen, um,
Sure.
I
Yeah.
mean, I can't quote the literature on it, but I've seen that there is research that actually bears that out.
Mm,
That
mm,
people who are Christians, um, evaluate their own results in life. They are more satisfied with their lives than people in other belief systems. So
right. Right.
you know,
Yeah.
and I always
If properly adhered to. Yeah. Exactly.
yeah, and I mean that's a big thing. There's a
Right.
lot of different things that you can point to in that. I mean, I've got one of Jesus' big pet peeves was the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the people that were like, you have to adhere to the law, and got the letter of the law and completely missed the spirit of the law, and
Right.
we're just the
Right.
busybodies who are trying to tell other people how to live, and
Right.
a lot of
Which, by the way,
applicable.
is the reason why I'm not religious necessarily, right? Is for that very reason. And also because I don't think that it's exclusive, it has any exclusivity towards truth either, right? Because I think there's a lot of, and a lot of what Christianity is based on is you see across other religions too. The golden rule is in one fashion or another in many, many religions, right? The Hammurabi
Mhm.
Code, all that kind of.
Yeah, but I I that stood out to me when you said that, because I felt like that was something that is useful to point out, because it's something that I've come back to, and again, I'm not advocating for a theocracy or saying that, because that's actually against the teachings of Jesus.
Right. Right.
That's trying to dictate that you have, that's the Pharisees. You have to do
Sure.
this, not okay, this is the instruction manual for how to, if you want to live a good life, this is kind of the things that you ought to follow to try to do that, and you're going to get the best result.
Right. Well, that's also why I believe so very strongly in the separation of church and state, right?
Right. Yeah, we
Because
don't
yeah,
again, that goes back to what I just said. The state should not be mandating that you must follow this particular religion. Well, I'll figure out exactly how I want to say this at some point, but one of my big personal beliefs is that, coercion, compulsion, however you want to look at that, is like the primary evil. So, if you're advocating anything where it's like you have to do this whether you believe in it or not, I have a real issue with that. Now, I mean, I'm
right.
sure we can find examples where, there are maladaptive behaviors that should be, prohibited, or there may be things that I really struggle to find anything that should be mandated, because I feel like any of the things that it should be stated that you have to do this are things that the consequences of not doing it would show pretty quickly. It's like,
Well, I mean, I think you're talking about when you say things, just to
behaviors.
clarify, you're talking about behaviors in the sense of like a moral or ethical or I mean, because there are certain there we do have basic rules, right? I mean, we all agree that in the United States we drive on the right side of the road, right? Those kind of basic rules that are coercive to a certain extent.
Well, that goes back to what I was just saying, is if you don't adhere to the common practice, there are going to be consequences to that, and those consequences are going to mandate, they're going to show up fairly quickly. I mean, you could say, well, you should be allowed to do whatever you want, but if everybody's driving on the right and you decide to drive on the left, bang.
Right. 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 Yeah,
you
and
know,
you're not gonna only maybe hurt yourself, but you're gonna hurt other people too, right?
right. So, I
Yeah.
mean, there's a question in a lot of that as to whether that needs to be coerced, or if it would just, to some extent work itself out. And I mean, that gets into a whole other discussion that, would completely derail what we're doing now. But,
Right. Right.
the idea of, um, what where, we brought this up in our first episode, but what is morality? Where does that come from? Well, how should we be deciding what we should and shouldn't do and all of that? We'll have to jump, get back to revisiting that at some point because it's not something that we really answered. And honestly, over the last 10 weeks, my perspective on that has changed a little bit. I mean,
Right.
I think when I
Kind of hard for it
raised that
not to, and yeah, with these kind of conversations.
yeah, I think when I raised that question, I would have said that there is like a universal morality. And I still don't necessarily think that that's not true, but I don't think it's self-evident because I feel
Mm,
like looking at history, there is nothing that we could conceive of. The most immoral things that we could possibly imagine have been considered moral by one society or another.
right, right. Well, when we talk about these issues, in your mind, how much of this relates directly to the tension between, say, individualism and collectivism? I
I
mean,
mean, that kind of goes back to what I was just talking about then, I guess. It's, the
okay.
idea of do other people tell me what how I have to live my life, or do I figure out what works, what
Oh,
I
I see
think
what you're
is the
saying. So
best way?
yeah, so you're
Yeah.
saying you drive on the right you agree to drive on the right side of the road not because people are telling you to necessarily, but
Because I don't
because
want to
it's the safest
die.
thing for you and everybody else.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean,
And
you know,
we agree in a sense you're saying that that's not really coercion, that's us just agreeing to do this.
yeah. And, I mean, that's one of the
Okay.
things that I look at too. It's like, okay, you could make something illegal, but that doesn't prevent people from doing it.
Right. Right. So in a sense what you're really saying is that um if we're talking about something like socialism versus capitalism, you're saying what you don't want to see, if I can spit back your perspective to you, what you don't
Absolutely.
want to see is having the system be imposed on you necessarily without you saying, yeah, I agree that this is just the right thing for us to do necessarily.
Yeah. You have to convince me.
Right.
And
Okay.
I mean, that
All
was
right.
that was kind of how I got here because I had a big problem with a lot of that during COVID.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Because I did not feel like that the arguments that were being made justified the decisions, the policies that were being undertaken.
Well, I mean, one of the problems with that is that nobody, and we have to admit this across the board, nobody had all of the full information to make a complete decision, right?
Right. But there were things that became fairly evident fairly quickly that were not acknowledged for a number of years, actually.
Right. Okay.
There was,
So
it was
would you say that
pretty,
that eroded trust in the sense of
that
the
was,
reasoning behind what you were seeing as coercion?
that's a fundamental point that I was, um, thinking about earlier today. I was kind of thinking about, like I said, kind of going back and answering the questions that we came into this with.
Hmm.
One of the main problems that I see, and one of the things that helps promote the division is that I feel like that we have had a fundamental erosion of trust in our society between each other, in our institutions, in the information that we're being presented, across the board.
So if I were to say that one of my reasons for leaning towards the more left perspective towards, socialism per se, I mean, again, like we've talked about many times, these labels are difficult because they come so loaded with history and with experience and on all these things. So I'm using this very loosely, right?
But
This
and
term
it's
right now in this
to
sense.
that point, that's always been my objection to the word because some of the concepts I don't disagree with, but my opinion on socialism is slightly more negative than my opinion on Satanism.
Mm, hmm.
So that's my issue with the whole thing. It's like and I acknowledge in the context of our previous discussions that when someone says socialism, that flips to my system one thinking, and
Right.
I'm like, you know, Are we at war? You
Yeah,
know.
well, when you say trust, like, from my perspective, and this may be one of these areas where we might find some slight disagreement on perspective, is that in one sense, there is a certain level of distrust that I have in trusting someone to that has all, great opportunities and becomes fabulously wealthy, on them checking their greed in a way that makes sure that they are not abusing the power that comes along with that wealth and things, right? So there's a certain level of distrust that I have, and I think what would be the opposite of that? What would be the opposite perspective? Is it distrust in the state doing it, or government, or just any power structure whatsoever forcing that limitation on personal freedom? What's the counterpart for that type of
So
distrust?
that's an area that I think that we would really need to dig into and figure out what's actually going on, because a lot of the things that I've looked at recently, obviously I don't know what's life is like for someone who is what we'd consider fabulously ridiculously wealthy.
Right.
Uh I don't have
Right,
that
and by
perspective.
that, let's define that, right? Let's just make sure we're defining that in a way that we agree on. For me, that means wealthy enough to where money and wealth does not is goes beyond its use, or its value as a currency, or as it becomes more than just wealth.
Well,
It
and
morphs into power. It morphs into, where money doesn't matter, right?
yeah,
Money's not no
fu
longer a
money.
concern, right?
Yeah.
Is that a good
I
way of describing what we're talking about when we say fabulously wealthy? Where money
I
just kind of doesn't mean anything anymore because you have more than you can ever spend.
I think that's close, but I think there are a lot of assumptions that are baked into the way that we talk about wealth in a society
Okay.
that are not true,
All
or
right.
are they're they need to be looked at. Because I mean, what I was going to say, when you raise this initially, is that you look at those people as being like completely autonomous and can do whatever they want because resources are not an issue. Where we don't realize how uh this is a loaded word, and I'm trying to think of another one to use. I was going to say compromised, but I don't think that's quite where I want to go with that. I mean, there's certainly a case to be made for that, but
Right.
how co-opted they are by the position that they're in, um, that they can't extricate themselves from that. It's not,
Mm.
it we the argument tends to be they look at that and it's like, oh, Elon Musk is earning money. He's got more money than he could ever know what to do with, and all he wants to do is earn more money. Where I don't think Elon Musk is concerned about earning money at all. He's doing things to try to solve problems, and I think this is evidenced by his compensation package at Tesla. He set particular goals that he wants to accomplish, and he will be compensated handsomely if those are accomplished. But if those aren't accomplished, he didn't get anything.
Do you
Um,
do you trust that his goals are in line with the maximum benefit of society?
um, I would say that not necessarily any more or less than the average person off the street.
Except
I'm
that
not.
he has that much more ability to actually put it into action
Yeah,
because of
he
that
has
wealth.
more ability, but I mean, even if you look at that, he's not autonomous. I mean, he is beholden to financing and investors and regulators and all of these different things, to where you know it's a good example of this, I think, is to look back. I don't know, I know you're a fan of history. no my wife likes to watch a lot of docudramas and that type of thing set in previous times, and we watched a lot of stuff that deals with royalty and nobility in like older ages. And one of the things is like it was Rain was the story of Mary Queen of Scots, the CW
Mhm.
thing that we watched. But one of the things that you pick up on when you watch these, and the Crown was another good one, the story of Elizabeth II. Um, one of the things that you realize when you're watching the stories of these kings and queens is that we grow up thinking that if you're a king and a queen or a queen, you can do whatever you want. You've got all the money that, more money that you could ever do anything with. And what you realize watching these, even in the dramatizations, which don't necessarily capture what it was actually like, you see that they're really, it's almost the opposite. They have very little choice and a lot of their actions are dictated by situation and what they need to how they need to respond to keep the kingdom together and to keep things going and what they need to do there. So, there's we always imagine the situations of other people that we're not in to be a particular thing, and I feel like when you start to see that, you realize that it's not always the case. I mean, even in the average person example, it's like, okay, you go get a good job. Uh, you've got pretty solid income. Hey, the average person, you're making $50,000 a year. You get a different job, you're making $100,000 a year, and you've always been like, man, I've been struggling, just to pay my rent and make my car payment and all of this, and I'm going to be great. And then, in the next couple of years, you buy a house, you get new furniture, you get a newer car, you get another car, and you find yourself very, very quickly where you're in a position, and we can talk about the economic structure of our country. That's a whole other fun discussion. But you're in a position where you are now, you have to keep that job. You are spending everything you're making and probably a little more. So you're beholden to your situation, and that just scales up. I mean, you look at, it's where you get the cautionary tale of MC Hammer, is had and you can see this all across the board on professional athletes. They get
Sure.
what we would consider, lottery winners. People who get,
Yeah.
fabulous amounts of money that it's like, oh, I'd be set for life. I could take care of myself. A year later, they're broke.
Right, but at the same time, would you well, let me just ask, would you consider somebody like a Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk as being more free than somebody that is, say, on welfare?
I don't think I could effectively make a case to argue, um, you know, that no, I don't think I could construct an argument to be able to say that no, they're less, they have equal or less freedom to somebody, but
Right.
I
No,
don't know
I'm
if
not
that's
I'm not saying that they are completely free, right? Because nobody is, right? Nobody is. I mean,
right. And I
this
don't
was
know
a
that
lot
that's a
easier when we were like a hunter-gatherer society, right? Because
yeah,
we had very small amount of things that we had to do, right, in order to survive. And if one person didn't help out, then we just kicked them out. Got rid of them.
yeah. I don't know that that's a fair comparison though, because there's a level of consideration of money, which is where the majority of us, I believe, fall, where money has to be a primary concern because you have to meet your needs.
Yeah, we have to eat.
Yeah,
Yeah.
we have to eat. We have to have shelter. We have to, we have
Basic
basic needs.
needs, basic necessities. Yeah.
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 And in 2026, we need internet, we need a cell phone,
Right.
there's all kinds
Right.
of additional things that we didn't have 100 years ago. So, yeah, I mean, for the average person, they're thinking about money because what what they have available and what they need to cover their basic needs are generally fairly close to each other, sometimes, a little less, sometimes a little more, but it's in that ballpark where money is at the top of your mind all the time.
Right.
And there's
Right.
a threshold there somewhere, and, it depends on the situation, but there's a threshold there that you get across to where you have enough money and it's not the primary thing that you need to think about anymore.
Right. Right. Well,
You go to the restaurant and you go to the restaurant that you want because that's what you want to eat, not what can I afford tonight. And when you get to the restaurant, you decide what you want because that's what sounds good and not what the cost is on the menu.
right. Right. Well, let me just push you a little bit on this because so if you were to design an ideal society, right? Um, would an ideal society be better with a an upper class that has immense wealth and a lower class which is eking out a survival, or would it be better to have everything lumped more in the middle?
As I mean,
Just looking as an ideal.
I
Do you see where I'm
understand
going?
I understand that's a scenario that has an obvious answer that, is difficult to argue against. The question is how do you get there?
Right. Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I mean, you acknowledged the fact earlier of capitalism raising people out of poverty. I mean, if you look at that, the statistics are staggering. And most people
They are. Sure. Yeah.
don't realize it's like 100 years ago, 90% of the population of the world was in poverty. n- You know, and I don't recall what poverty actually means numerically, but
Right. Right. Sure.
it's it's defined in the course of, when these statistics are reported. Whereas now 90% of the world is out of poverty. So that's a
Right.
huge shift.
It's a huge swing. Yeah. No, and I agree. And look, you can point to countries all around the world, even China, right, as being able to, at some level, use capitalism in their own way, of course, to lift a lot of people in their country out of poverty, right? And it's you can't really argue the history of it against that.
Yeah, and I mean, if you're going to be honest, you also can't argue that there are problems with the way that things are done. You can't
Right.
just say, you know, capitalism. It's there.
Yeah. Well,
There are
that's
things
that's
that
why
need to
I
be
was
considered, but
that's that's why I was pushing on that individual but versus collective kind of idea because again, there's an irony here as well in that sense that um, individualism works best when individuals are considering the needs of the collective, and collectivism works best when the collective is protecting the needs of each individual, right?
right.
So, and we tend to push each other into these labels that tend to push us one side or the other to the extremes, but really it seems to me that there's a balance to be had between them, right?
Well, this is a good time to get into, and I was trying to figure out where I had this actually kind of written out in a
Mhm.
formula that I was going to be able to give, but I don't remember which note that I had it in. So, the basic idea on that is something that I alluded to earlier, and this is a good time to lay that out. Um, Going back to your idea of the lattice, the network of society.
Mhm.
Um, the the thought
The
that I
terms and
had on
conditions, I think I called it, right?
yeah, the thought that I had on that was what in terms of the individual and the collective, because
Mhm.
you need consideration for both. I mean,
Sure.
it's not whether you need all of one or all of the other. There's a balance to be struck. And I thought that the great, the best example that I could think of on that as, symbolically represented is the yin and yang. Um, where you've got, the balance of the black and white, where you need to consider the individual and the collective, but you've got the little dot of the opposite color in the main body where, you know, the collective needs to be focused on the individual, and the individual needs to be focused on the collective.
Right. Right. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
if you have a society where the collective is willing to sacrifice the individual, you're in big trouble.
So, and
Um,
vice versa.
yeah, and if you have an individual who doesn't care about the rest of their community, then they're going to be a big problem. So,
Right. Right. And I think we can agree. This is another area where we could probably find some agreement is that if we as a society, as a collective, decided that we saw somebody, an individual that was doing stuff that was directly harming the collective, we would feel within our rights, I think, as a collective to act on that individual, would we not?
yeah, I mean, this is,
And vice versa.
this is
And
why
that's
I'm
why you
not
don't
a
like the coercion of socialism over society and the individuals, because that's that in the reverse, right?
this is why I'm not an anarchist, although I've heard some pretty compelling argument.
Sure.
I've heard it presented in a way that it's like, okay, that makes a lot of sense, but I don't believe that that's actually feasible to have a fully anarchic society. You know, we need laws.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and that's kind of the idea of absolute liberty, right? I
Yeah,
mean, everybody has can just do whatever they want whenever they want, and, just the chips fall where they may.
and it's. I mean, philosophically, that's libertine versus liberty, but um, you know,
Ironically, it's also hyper optimistic, isn't it?
yeah,
That a society could actually survive that way.
yeah, and I mean, then you get into libertarian, which is like anybody should be able to do what they want, up to the extent of what they can reach with, the the end of their fingers. If it,
Mhm,
impacts
mhm.
anyone else, then, but no, I mean, we need laws. And
Yep,
there the unfortunate thing is, and this is one of the lessons that I learned in um I'd mentioned to you recently. I don't think I've mentioned it on here. um you have your experience of being on city council and involved in local government.
yep.
I was the president of my HOA for about 7
Similar
years.
role, actually, yeah.
Yeah. Um, and that was honestly, it's the majority of the existence of the HOA. Um, Not particularly because I wanted any power. Nobody else wanted to do it, and I wanted to keep them away from my house. So, it was a defensive position. But that's one of the things that I saw, and it's like the idea behind a homeowners association is that we're all going to come together and we're going to agree to certain standards and keep our property in a certain way for the benefit of everyone in the community.
Right, right.
That's the goal. And then, what you have is that you have people that want to come in, the condo commandos, or whatever, that want to come in and they want to dictate to everyone else how they should be keeping their property. So it's
Right, but we also agree that there are some overarching rules that we can agree on, I hope. Like, for example, discriminatory rules of people not being allowed to, purchase a home if they were a certain race or a certain religion, Jewish or whatever.
Yeah, and
So
again,
we agree on that.
that kind of goes back to the basic idea of, what we were talking about with, following the practices of Christianity. That, I mean, that goes back to what we're looking at describing that society, which we thought was good, is like everybody agrees to this framework, and then we go from there. And, so I mean, that's with my HOA example too. It's everybody agrees to this, and then, we can hold people accountable if they fall outside of what we all initially agreed to. And
Right.
that's kind of the perspective that I see laws in too. I mean, that was kind of the basic idea of the legal framework. It's like, you know, I would
Yeah, I
prefer if
mean,
you
but
don't
pushing a
kill
little bit.
me,
Go
so
ahead.
I'm not going to kill you. And, these are kind of the basic, initial laws that we started out with. And, and your traffic example is like, okay, this could be a real mess, but if we all agree that we're gonna drive on the right side of the road, and we're going to stop when the light turns red, and we're going to stop at a stop sign and take our turns. Um, you know,
Yeah,
yeah,
those are really a balance between individual and collectivist decisions, right?
yeah, yeah, because I mean, they are legally mandated, but I mean, there are people that violate all of those laws. So, having a law doesn't necessarily, you cannot 100% coerce behavior under almost any circumstances until we get to, chips in people's brains that can control what they do.
Right, right.
So there is still a certain amount of choice involved in there at some level.
So let me push on this just a little bit further and say, um, one of the things that bothers me about our system, the way that we have it now in terms of our economic system, is that in a democracy, especially in a democracy where we uh, don't have any kind of limitations on what people can spend on political races and things like that, um, that money and wealth inevitably can be translated into power in a sense. And so my concern is that if we allow complete liberty in terms of even economic advancement, that at some point that can come back on us and limit our own liberty by someone becoming too powerful. Because I think we do agree that if we're just talking about power, not wealth, we could probably agree that we want limitations on individuals having power over the collective.
Right, which, goes back to my
'Cause that's
thinking.
authoritarianism.
Yeah, which goes back to my thinking on power should be concentrated as locally as it can be. The bottom up versus the top down. If you concentrate all of the power above, then that doesn't work as well as if you concentrate all of that power. It's like the power within your household and then within your town and then within your state. And, so that's part of the thinking on there. Um,
Well, I've gotten
as
pushback sometimes. I mean, I've put forward the idea in the past, and it's not just my right-leaning friends that push back hard on me on this, it's my left-leaning friends too, where I say, "Well, maybe we should limit people's wealth. Maybe there should be an upper cap," right? There are people who have suggested that. I'm not necessarily saying there absolutely should be. I'm saying maybe we should at least have that conversation.
I want to answer that, I want to go back and answer the last question that you asked
Mhm.
too. So bring me back to that if I forget what the question was. But
Okay.
um, I feel like the danger in that perspective is that it tends to assume the idea that um, wealth is a zero sum game. Is that
Does it?
yeah? Or it leans in that direction because if you're limiting somebody's wealth, you're making the assumption that because they're wealthy, someone else isn't. And it may be the case that there are people with more and less wealth, but that's not necessarily causational. It's potentially correlated.
But what if I'm right that there's a point at which wealth ceases to be wealth and in the traditional sense of it and becomes simply power?
The way we talk about that in the conversation, though, is um, we talk about wealth like it's Scrooge McDuck or, a dragon with chests of coins and jewels, in the dungeon. Whereas, wealth in our current society today means access to huge amounts of debt. So,
Right, but
even
even that kind of becomes kind of a shell game, does it not? I mean, because, you know, a lot of these a lot of people that are fabulously wealthy and, there's a lot of talk about reining this in with laws, and regulations, but, a lot of them don't ever spend their money, right? All they do is use their money as collateral to borrow more money, and then they use that to buy stuff and do, buy homes and boats and expensive weddings in Italy
and businesses.
and businesses. Yeah, and businesses. Yeah, and in some senses, countries.
So going back to answering the previous question, this is where I go back to an idea that I've raised in a couple of more recent conversations, to where I've come around to the idea that with the different perspectives that are floating around, especially when perspectives tend to be binary, it's not an either or situation, it's a yes and the different people things that people are focused on are pieces of the puzzle, but they're not the entire puzzle. So when you look at people who have access to wealth, the part that I feel like is being missed in that conversation is the apparatus that produces money. Because there is an overarching system there that controls whether people have access to wealth, how much wealth that they can get. It's we th-
Right.
we
Well,
like
that's
the
that's
I
that's the whole argument that we talked about this before with Yanis Varoufakis, the former finance minister of
Mr.
Greece, in his
Grease.
book Techno-Feudalism, right? Because he's basically saying that about the central banks following the 2008 crisis, right? As they started just printing money like mad.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean
And that
that's
just accelerated under COVID, by the way, as well.
right, exactly. Yeah, and it's created our situation that we have now. It's why the value of the dollar went down 25% over the last 5 years.
Right,
Um
right. Yeah,
so yeah, I mean, that's a lot of the issue. You've got the central banks, and you've got the layer in and around that, which is also the financial management firms that we talk about. It's who has the levers of control over who else, and I mean that the financial management firms are a great example of that. You've got BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street that own operational control basically of the entire S&P 500. They own, collectively they own 7 to 10% of each of those companies, which is enough to sway gets who gets elected to boards and what the policies of those companies are.
right, right.
And that also includes each of those companies. Um,
Well,
so
does that
BlackRock
mean that go ahead with BlackRock? Yeah, go ahead.
BlackRock owns part of State Street and Vanguard. State Street owns
Right.
part of Vanguard and BlackRock. You know,
Right.
yeah.
Yeah. So is that I got to remember my train of thought here, but um well, keep going on that anyway.
Well, it's so that
Oh,
I
I know,
feel
I
like
remember what I was going to say.
go ahead.
So does that mean that Peter Thiel, founder of PayPal and all that and Palantir and all that, um was he right then when he said several years ago in an essay that he wrote that democracy and capitalism are incompatible?
It depends on what you're referring to as capitalism, because I I would make the case that we haven't had capitalism in 113 years.
Well, that's again the thesis of the techno-feudalism book, right? He thinks capitalism is dead, and we're now in techno-feudalism,
Right.
with people like with Peter Thiel, right, being one of the people that's one of the lords in the
But
new
it's you
cloud
know
serfdom.
maybe we need to kind of drill down onto this at some point, but I this is where I've been trying to define, what eh, the for lack of a better term, global power structure actually is. And it's so hard to even begin to discuss this because you end up immediately in prime conspiracy theory territory.
Sure, yeah, yeah,
Because
and it also leads. Go ahead.
anytime you introduce the idea that there is anything superseding the government that controls, the behavior of nations or, regions or the world or anything like that, you're a conspiracy theorist because that's, you know That's the conspiracy theory, is that there's other agencies out there, whether it's the Bilderberg
Secret
Group or
cabal.
the Trilateral Commission or the World Economic Forum or the UN or the Illuminati or.
Well, you know what, you know the direction you're going with this conversation, right? You're going to kind of one of the hearts that I think we're identifying as um, one of the differences in our perspectives, or at least the directions that we're coming at it from, leading directly to the whole clash between establishment versus anti-establishment. Does it not?
Yeah, and I mean, I guess that's another way to look at what I am talking about would be the
Hmm.
establishment. And, you know, and people where you have to break away from the conspiracy theory ideas that um people have this idea that it's a very small group that is completely in agreement and completely in power when it's like I brought up last time or earlier with the idea of OPEC, where it's different entities that frequently have similar goals that are interconnected to push things in a particular direction. This is
Right.
like
Well, you said that going all the way back to our fourth episode, episode 4, when we talked about psyops, right? Because
yeah.
we talked about the they and the them, and I think the point that you were making at the time was that the point isn't necessarily to only just to identify who the they or the them is, right? Because it's not necessarily that. It's more amorphous than that, I guess,
Yeah, because if you
in some sense.
start trying to point that out, especially if you're looking at, you know, if you pick out one aspect of the global power structure, there's this little shell game that you can play. It's like, is it the techno feudalists or is it the central bank or is it the
Or is it Wall
government?
Street?
Or is it Wall
Right.
Street?
Right.
Or is
Right.
it the
Or is
wealth
it the government? Yeah,
managers?
exactly. Yep. Yep. Well, that's kind of why I brought up, and maybe this is where we head next in our conversation, is in that discussion of kind of drilling down into that whole idea of establishment, and what it means to push back on the establishment, assuming that we can even agree on what the establishment is, because that's what you're getting at, right? Is that there's not necessarily a widespread agreement on who or what the establishment is.
I feel like it gets broken down into everybody wants to identify one aspect of it. And where the division comes is not necessarily that the people who are disagreeing with them think they're wrong, but they see a different aspect of it as kind of being more important, and then there's a
Okay, so
disagreement.
it's a ranking necessarily of
Yeah, I mean,
the different
the
aspects.
the example I think that we can point to as being the easiest to identify as understand is the left thinks it's the corporations and the right thinks it's the government.
Right, and yeah, in a perfectly simplistic way, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, being overly simplistic because
Right,
there's like 6 different aspects of it or whatever, but
right.
um
Well, and also, we will probably find a lot of agreement on the fact that the lines these days between those 2 are blurred to the point of almost indistinction.
right. Yeah, and
Yeah.
and nobody wants to acknowledge that, and they want to just point fingers at the other side or whatever, and that goes back to my idea that you're seeing the individual pieces, but you're missing the bigger picture.
Mm, mhm.
So I mean, I feel like, and again, I'm uncomfortable, talking about because you start to sound crazy very quickly if you don't have the background in which is why we're doing this conversation. You've got to have the background in explaining these positions to see where things are coming from. Because if you just go, you know, well, it's the global power structure. It's like, oh, he's a conspiracy theorist. I can discount him. Um,
Sure,
but
yeah.
yeah, the establishment, in an overly simplistic definition, the establishment would be the people who are currently in power, that have been in power, and want to stay in power.
Right, and especially the people that have in their power, ways to affect our liberty or lack thereof.
Yeah, and and there are mechanisms to gain and maintain that power, And wealth is one of them, but wealth is almost a byproduct. Um, it can be somewhat of a driving force, but I don't think it is necessarily in the way that it's frequently looked at. Um,
You're saying it's not the thing in and of itself.
no, because I feel like the system is so rigged that wealth is bestowed and not earned.
Well, rigged, even using that word suggests a a nefariousness, but also an establishment that has control,
Yeah, well,
because you can't
as
rig something if you don't have control of it.
we've talked about the concept where I believe that there have been, and this is the downside of regulation. I think I'd mentioned the idea that I'd had before, that every every regulation that is put in place is an opportunity to manipulate the system.
Sure. Yeah, it can be.
That's not to say that, we need no regulation on anything. I mean, it's a balance like everything else, but it's a thread that you can pull to be able to get things to be the way that you want them to. I mean, if you look at like the asset managers and the amount of stock that they own, we had the example, a few years ago of the whole GameStop thing, where if you get enough if you get enough shares of stock to work collectively, you can manipulate the stock market.
Right. Well, I mean, you're almost describing in some ways the crypto market right now.
Yeah, I mean, and that's where it gets into being really tricky on the idea of, you know, capping or, taxing people's wealth, because a lot of that is tied up, like you say, it's leveraged, and it's leveraged in business and that type of thing. And, even with other assets, whether that would be real estate or gold or whatever, if you do that too much, you will, if you force someone to liquidate assets to be able to meet a requirement, then anytime you sell any kind of asset in bulk, it devalues that asset. So, you kind of mess up all kinds of different markets by doing, there's all kinds of potential unintended consequences, um, versus, what we're trying to accomplish. So it's, kind of one of those areas where you've got to really look at what is your goal, and then what do you expect to happen?
Well, to bring this kind of full circle here and kind of tie this all up, um, seems to me, and tell me if you agree with this or not, that a lot of that comes back to whether when we're talking about regulation or we're talking about limits on individual or collective freedoms, a lot of that comes back to messing with that balance between the individualism and collectivism and the mutual goals and the dependencies between the two. Don't you
Yeah,
think?
for me, I look at a lot of that and I feel like the more you try to control or direct the outcomes, especially, for the noble goal of eliminating the negative outcomes, the more the more control is available to control the outcomes. And
Right. But at the same time, you also have said in the past that you do believe in just in generally in the idea of some level of regulation.
I do, but and we could look at this historically. I've also I've come to the opinion in a lot of things that one of the issues that we have frequently is that we have the excesses that we have now as a result of things that we have tried to regulate in the past, and these are workarounds that have been found to to get around those regulations.
That would be hard to argue against.
So, I mean, we need to consider very carefully that, again, those are unintended consequences. So it's like you need to, and again, this may go back to the whole point of kind of why we started talking about things. It's like we can fundamentally agree on the goals or how we'd like to see things work out, but I think the discrepancy in a lot of things, which is healthy, is in how to get there. And I feel like a lot of times, I think I've raised this point before too. A lot of times the argument gets devolved, and both sides do this differently depending on which side they're trying to argue. Um, as to where you focus on either this is how I want things to be, or this is how I think things are going to work out.
Well, we certainly can agree that we don't want the cure to be worse than the disease.
Right.
And, but I think maybe the next one of the things we want to talk about going forward is more on that idea of establishment versus anti-establishment, and kind of what that means and what that means in terms of what kind of crude society we want to create together. And then maybe talk about what that should mean or what we hope for that to mean in order to not want to necessarily tear it down or rebuild everything. What do you think?
Yeah. I've kind of presented some of my thinking on that. I would be very interested to get your perspective on,
Hmm.
kind of the same subject. What do you see as the establishment? What do you see as the function of the establishment? And the point
Well,
that
we
you
have a
raised.
lot of that conversation going on right now with the dismantling and destruction of various institutions, right?
Right.
That for right or wrong have been seen by some as not doing the job that they were intended to do in a way that is beneficial to both the individual and the collective.
Yeah, and I mean, I think another topic that we can bring into this, something that we were talking about last night offline, is the idea of populism and how I think that is popularly, shallowly understood as just being the the power structure doesn't reflect my needs or doesn't
Sure.
reflect, the desires of the people versus the more technical definition, which is the people don't feel represented, and so they want to tear down the power structure and start over.
Right,
Um,
right.
because I
Yeah.
think there's a lot
And
of
and that is the dichotomy between, I mean, because populism is kind of inherently anti-establishment, right?
right, which
Yeah. Well,
I was,
populism would be a very interesting topic to bring into this discussion at this point.
I had the thought last night. It's like you, you know, a conservative populist would be an oxymoron in that division definition.
You would think, yeah. And it's funny because you have a similar tension and dichotomy on the left between people who would consider themselves quote liberal, right? That label
Uh huh.
versus people that consider themselves progressive, whereas progressives are the more revolutionary and the liberal are more institutional and gradual in their desires.
Yeah, I mean, and trying to figure out what labels applied where, progressive is the one that I felt was most descriptive of the current left. But maybe we can bring that in a little bit and talk about that a
Sure.
little bit too. So,
Yeah. Yeah.
but
Well, I'm
yeah,
sure it'll come up, but yeah.
sounds
Well, this is I think been very helpful for me. I hope you now have a better understanding of kind of where I'm coming from when we start to use that term again. I wince every time I use the word
well,
socialism, right? Because it's not completely, it doesn't fulfill all the needs that I need for that word to fulfill. Let me
I
put it that way.
I think that, in saying that, you're somewhat in agreement with what my position on that has always been, is that, and you and I can't control the conversation in the
No.
country or the larger world yet. Um, but, my point has always been we need to stop using that word.
Right. Right. Yeah.
It's too loaded and it's defeating whatever, because as soon as somebody gets into well, the fire department's socialist, we need to socialize things, like, shut up. Uh,
Yeah. I mean, it's yeah, yeah. I mean, look, I came prepared I could have talked about, the national park system, for example, right? Or because there are certain industries too that we could go down that road and talk about whether it's moral or ethical for them to be for profit industries, right? Or whatever. But that's a whole nother ball of wax, something that we'll probably have to get to at some point. Um, but in the meantime, I want to just remind everything as we're wrapping this up for this week. Um, please do. hit that like button, hit that subscribe button. Like you said, Dean, last week, it really does make a world of difference. Also, for us to see any comments that you have, because we want to make sure that this is not just beneficial to us, because it's going to be for us, but we want it to be beneficial for everyone who watches this. So, because one of the things that we do share in terms of our goal is to try to find a little more synchrony in our society.
Right. Yeah, and that's another point that I was gonna raise too that, you got in there. I would love to see a little more engagement. We're starting to see some comments on YouTube. We've got a Facebook group if you wanna get on there, I'd love
Yep.
to see some comments on there. We are on X.
Eventually, we're gonna launch the Patreon and all that, so there'll be plenty of opportunities for people to get involved.
Yeah, it started out as a conversation for us, and we're gonna continue having it whether anybody else is following it or not, but we'd like to hear from you too.
Absolutely. Yep. Well, on that note, I hope you have a great week, Dean, and we'll keep this conversation going next week for week 11.
You too. See you next week.
All right, take care.